Great. Thank you so much. It is great to be here. It is great to see everyone. And it's particularly great for me to be here because I was a Growth Lab Fellow part-time after my HKS Masters in Public Policy in 2015 to 16. So this is where I got immersed in the logic of growth diagnostics and binding constraints that has been what has informed our paper here. So this is a paper that Ed and I are working on also with Dan Turner, who was an MPP here and now works for the South Yorkshire Mayoralty in the UK. And we're looking at the UK's regional economic inequality and trying to understand whether we can identify more or less binding constraints on productivity growth in the UK's lagging regions, and therefore identify what the most impactful levers for policy intervention to boost productivity in those regions are. And we're interested in all questions and comments. Obviously, we're in the process of revising the paper after we present it, and particularly interested in your views on what kinds of aspects of the diagnostic process we might be missing, what kinds of metrics we might be able to use quantitatively for some of these areas that we're not using now, and how to think about complementarities between the constraints. So, all comments and questions are very, very welcome. So what we'll do today is we'll start by just characterizing what the problem is and why the UK is an interesting context to look at this regionally, and argue that the key problem we want to look at is productivity disparities between London and the southeast of the UK and the other regions. We'll then look at these 4 policy areas: education, infrastructure, access to finance, and research and development. And then we'll ask, even if we don't see convergence in productivity across regions, why don't we see regional convergence in economic outcomes through migration? So I'll start by just characterizing the problem. Basically, we're going to argue that there are 5 stylized facts that make us focus on this one aspect of the UK's regional inequality problem, which is large, persistent, and growing productivity differentials between London and the southeast and the rest. And for an audience that is not, intrinsically focused on the UK, I think it's also worth emphasizing that the UK is actually an interesting context to study here because it is particularly regionally unequal amongst industrialized economies. So on a number of different measures, if you look at productivity, if you look at average incomes, if you look at disposable household incomes, mean or median, if you look at large regions or if you look at small regions, if you compare the UK to other OECD economies, it's consistently amongst the top in terms of regional inequality on those metrics. And on many of those metrics, it is at the top. So the UK is a very regionally unequal economy. It has been so for some time, and its regional inequalities are growing. The other interesting point about the UK, as we're thinking about growth diagnostics and convergence across regions, is that the UK is geographically very small. So when we're thinking about these big differences between London and the southeast of the UK and the north of England, we're talking about distances that you can cover in 2 to 4 hour train trips. So we're talking about productivity or income differentials that are equivalent to something like putting Mississippi next to Connecticut in the US context. So we're talking about big income and productivity differentials over a very small space, which is, I think, another aspect that makes it interesting to ask, why haven't these productivity disparities equalized over time across these relatively small spaces? So let me just show a little bit of evidence on some of these. So we're going to argue productivity is the key factor here. And we argue this, we focus on productivity rather than employment. So when we're thinking about, for example, the US context, one of the big and salient features of regional disparities in economic outcomes is big differences in employment levels across places. You've got many places that have these very concentrated high levels of persistent non-employment, particularly for men. These are particularly sort of deindustrialized regions. In the UK, this was true in the 1980s. In the wake of deindustrialization, you saw very big employment disparities across places. Those have largely converged over time, not fully, but largely. And now when you look at international context, it's productivity disparities and not employment disparities that really stands out. We're looking between London and the Greater Southeast versus the rest of the UK. Again, when you're looking intra-regionally, you're going to see differentials at every level. You're going to see disparities between large regions. You're going to see disparities within regions, between cities and towns, between towns and the rest. Why are we looking at this level of basically large regions? It's because this is the area where, again, the UK stands out most in international context. So if you take the average labour productivity in London and the southeast of England versus the rest of the UK, that disparity is now as big as the disparity in productivity between East and West Germany or North and South Italy. In fact, it's bigger than both of those. So again, it's a disparity that really stands out in international context and stands out more than in many other countries. And the final reason we're looking at this, the sort of like striking fact in the UK context, is that the large non-London cities are what's driving this disparity. So in most countries, again, you get this in the industrialized world, you get very, very large urban rural productivity differentials and very large urban town city town productivity differentials. The phenomenon based on agglomeration effects. In the UK, if you take London out of the equation, you see very little evidence for agglomeration effects. The UK's large cities that aren't London are no more productive than their large towns. And the rural areas are also not particularly poor. So we're basically arguing that these big productivity disparities are largely going to be driven by the underperformance of the big urban agglomerations that are outside London.
Manchester, Liverpool.
Yes, Manchester, Liverpool, to some extent also, well, actually Birmingham, and then to some extent the Leeds, Sheffield area, Newcastle and Glasgow will be the main ones we'll be thinking about. Exactly.
But for their size, Manchester and Birmingham are unusually productive in this scale.
That's right. Yes, I don't have that graph today for us, but it's Manchester and Birmingham that particularly stand out because they're the biggest cities. They're both about 2 million people and they're very, very low GVA per worker. Yeah. So the next thing I'm going to sort of motivate in terms of motivating our analysis is that not all of these differentials are just compositional. It's not all explained by industry mix. It's not all explained by education mix. So the first thing to focus is on industry. And it's worth emphasizing here that industry mattered a lot in the UK's story of regional economic inequality. So I'm going to show this in two ways with this graph. So you can see the employment share in manufacturing and mining, which we're calling industry, heavy industry here in 1980, across Western European regions, and then the change in that employment share from 1980 to 2019. So the first thing to note is that the UK is very regionally dispersed as of 1980 across its industry composition. It's got some of the most industrialized regions in Western Europe, the Midlands and Yorkshire. It's also got some of the least industrialized regions, London and the Southeast. And if you did the same graph with the finance and business services share, you'd see London and the Southeast were some of the most regionally specialized already in the 1980s in finance and business services. So you had these two big trends that hit all industrialized economies, right? The big increase in finance and business services, the big decline in employment in manufacturing and mining. The UK was already regionally very divergently exposed to those trends. But we also see that the UK was particularly fast at deindustrializing, even relative to its initial exposure. And you can see that by the fact that the red dots, which are the UK, are consistently below all of the other countries at any point in this graph. So particularly the Midlands and Yorkshire deindustrialized much faster than comparable German and Italian and other European regions that were similarly industrialized. Also, if you go a little bit lower down, the north of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, again, deindustrialized faster than other comparable regions in other European countries.
So the y-axis, should we understand it as 30% decline for West Midlands?
Yes, exactly. So there was a 30% decline in the employment share, percentage point decline. So a huge decline, a huge regional change in the employment structure. And in terms of relating this to cities, you can think of Birmingham is the biggest city in the West Midlands, and then we're talking Manchester is in the northwest, which is here, and then we've got sort of Sheffield and Leeds and Yorkshire and Humber here. But having said that about the different industrial patterns over time, when you now look at the industrial mix, you've seen a lot of convergence, largely because of this. Still, London is more specialized in finance and business services. Still, the north of England and the Midlands are more specialized in manufacturing. But those industrial structures have converged very rapidly over time. So now if you just do a very simple back of the envelope counterfactual exercise where you say, what happens if we give each of these regions the industry composition of London, holding that region's productivity within industry constant? Or what happens if we give that region London's industry productivity, but hold constant that region's industry composition? What you see is that the vast proportion of the gap between the regions in London is made up by within industry productivity and not industry composition. So you can see that here. The blue is each region's GVA per worker. The red is the counterfactual, giving each region London's sectoral composition, but keeping each region's sectoral productivity. And the orange is the counterfactual, giving them London's industry productivity and holding constant the composition. We have the green as an intermediate case, which only gives London's productivity for tradable industries, because it's a little bit unclear what you mean by giving interpersonal services productivity of of London to other regions. But you can see that the gap is not closed almost at all by changing the region's industry composition to London. And the reason for that is that the regions outside of London and the Southeast have very low GVA per worker in finance and business services, and that's very high in London. And they actually have very high GVA per worker in manufacturing, so that what manufacturing has remained is very productive. So if you're switching their industry composition to make it more like London, you're taking away their very productive manufacturing industry and replacing it with not a particularly productive services industry.
Can I ask you,
Yeah.
just on the measure of productivity, sometimes we have trouble with multi-plant firms that book revenues in their headquarters, and since the headquarters tend to be in London, maybe the GVA is sort of like inflated by the place where income is booked.
That's a great point. We should think about that. I don't think we have a way of seeing that, but we should find out if that's a problem. Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah.
Also, how granular are your definitions of like business services? Because one thing that I noticed in the UK, you get firms that are in London and they put all their like exciting services in London and put their IT or like admin office out in Birmingham, and maybe it's all business services, but
yeah, absolutely. So this definition is very broad. This is just very broad sectors. Other scholars have done this with the 4-digit NAICS industries, so much narrower, and find the same thing. But even that doesn't account for the point that you're raising. And in some sense, that point could be, I mean, in some sense, that is a reflection of different productivity in that you're allocating tasks with different productivity within a firm to different places. But it's a slightly more nuanced idea than you're doing the same type of consulting task, but it's giving you different fees, and more that the tasks are different. I'm sure that's a big part of what's going on, and we can't see that. Thanks.
So we have an online question.
Oh, yeah. Education. The reality is being a lawyer or a particular aspect of financial services in KPMG is quite a different role if you're in London, if you're doing it in Leeds or Manchester, and actually data doesn't pick that up for the wages.
Yeah.
And that is what we see.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have an online question.
Wonderful.
JR?
Hi, no, this is super interesting. I was just wondering, right, like if the issue is within industry productivity differentials, like this brings the literature on misallocation, right? So on that, like one question that I would have is whether you have data that is granular enough to do like these misallocation measurements of dispersions in productivity for producers within narrow industrial bandwidths, bins, and maybe showing that would be super interesting. But also, more theoretically, it's like usually in this literature, there's comparison between, across countries. And usually the explanations behind the reasons for misallocation are like, policy differentials, special treatment. But what could be, within UK factors that could explain these, would these differences be explained by why doesn't it balance out, right? Like why? So those are my two questions: whether like data allows for you to measure misallocation locally, but also like what would be the drivers of misallocation in a within country setting? As you were saying, like geography is small, rather well integrated, where good infrastructure for mobility. What would be the factors behind that?
Yeah, great points. Thank you. On the misallocation point, we haven't looked at the firm level data in a way that would help us get at the misallocation point. There is some work looking at the dispersion of firm level productivity across UK regions, and basically finding that a lot of the non-London regions have just sort of a fatter, low productivity tail. So that might be an indicator of it, but we haven't looked at it ourselves. It's a good point. In terms of why, I think that's in some ways part of what we're going to be trying to dive into in the next section is it an issue of misallocation in the sense that there are high productivity opportunities that aren't being taken by firms, or is it a case that there is some reason that productivity is just highly productive economic opportunities are just difficult to come by in these other regions, even given the free labor mobility and capital mobility we see across regions. So I would love to follow up with you either later in the talk or online if we don't try and get at that.
Another question, Kishan?
Yeah, just to follow up on that one. I know you had mentioned that employment rates have converged. I think it would be really interesting. I don't know if you've checked this or not, whether or not the situation currently is a spatial equilibrium or not, because that would then motivate that you want to focus on place-based policies, not getting people to the more productive areas. So that might be interesting. I don't know to what extent there is misallocation across space, or whether we're in a spatial equilibrium, and so any gains have to come from increasing productivity in places.
Kishan, do you mean spatial equilibrium in terms of labor mobility, or also in terms of like capital?
I was thinking more in terms of labor mobility, but capital would also be super interesting to look at.
Yeah, good point. So we're going to argue at the end, actually, that part of the reason we're not seeing convergence is because it is a spatial equilibrium in labor mobility, because housing costs are so high in London. And so it's a kind of policy failure generated spatial equilibrium in some sense. But the marginal mover for lower and middle educated people, we're going to argue, is actually not seeing any net income gains from moving to London. And therefore we're sort of stuck in this non-convergence equilibrium because of that. It doesn't necessarily follow, to your point, that the only route would be to increase productivity, because the other route could be release constraints on building in London and moving to London. But that's the approach that we're going to take. So the other point to emphasize on the kind of characterizing of the problem is that mechanically education explains a lot of these differentials, but it doesn't explain it all. So I don't have the graph. So we just see that regions with more highly educated populations in the UK, as everywhere, have much higher productivity, and part of this is mechanical. But if you estimate, for example, region wage differentials and control for education, you still see large differentials across regions, suggesting that not all of these differentials are mechanical effects of education. It could be that there are spillover effects, it could be other things, but it's not simply compositional. So we can show that here. We estimate individual log wage regressions from the UK's labour force survey and estimate region fixed effects conditional on different sets of controls. And these are cumulatively additive over the specification. So you can see, for example, that the blue is just saying how much more does someone of the same age and sex in London earn relative to someone of the same age and sex in the Northeast, which is the region with the lowest wage premium in England. So you can see that that raw wage premium is about 40%. If you then control for education, that reduces the London wage premium relative to the Northeast to about 30%. So it's doing a lot of work, but by no means all of the work. If you even also control for industry and occupation, you only reduce it to about 20%. This is in the private sector. So you're still seeing these very big wage differentials across place that we would argue would reflect these productivity differentials that aren't fully explained by education.
Do you have any, I mean, we were probably going there, but differences in cost of living?
Yeah. So all of the median individual's wage premium in London is absorbed by differences in housing costs across place. We don't have, annoyingly, in this data, we don't have housing costs, so we have to infer it from a different source, but yeah. So then the question is, how can policy boost productivity in lagging regions? If we accept that that is kind of the main characterizing, the main driving force of the unusual problem in the UK, and we take a binding constraint approach. So we're basically taking the growth diagnostic lens on this and trying to understand which boost to inputs would have the biggest incremental impact on productivity growth, and can we use different market-based signals to infer which of those are more or less scarce relative to supply. So I don't need to go through that for this audience. Yeah, I know, it's just like really nice. Don't have to go through the barrel.
Time last week in the Bank of England team. They have to understand complements and substitutes.
Yeah, exactly. This one I'm like, oh, we can just move straight through. So we're mostly going to be focusing on thinking about the price of different inputs, but we're also going to be, for things like research and development later, trying to be thinking about different ways that we can measure the kind of absorptive capacity of the region and the relative demand and supply. So would love people's input on these factors. So we'll go through the 4 factors now. It's going to be education, infrastructure, mostly focusing on transport, R&D, and then access to finance. So we start with education. And as I just mentioned, you see this very strong gradient between the share with a tertiary education in the UK and average productivity, GVA per worker. But this may, as we know, reflect simply a lack of demand for highly educated workers in those regions. So it may not be the case that boosting education in these regions is going to be the most impactful way to boost productivity in those regions. And that is, in the context of a country with free labor mobility, a function of 2 things. It might be that the return to actual university education in these regions is low. And it might also be that giving someone a university education, if they are from the Northeast, means they just moved to London. And so the impact is low. So we've got sort of two channels by which this may matter. So yes, Mohammed.
Do you have the value added per worker? Like, do you divide the total value added to the worker to get the y-axis?
Yes.
Yeah. But like, what about the capital share or the share that goes? Like, do we know anything about that aspect?
Yeah, so we could do this with TFP. It would look very similar, but we haven't done that. I guess the way of saying that is the fact that this looks quite similar with TFP suggests the action isn't really in capital. The reason we're a little wary of using TFP for our main measure, but maybe we should because we are hearing this comment more, is that because a lot of the disparate, like the UK economy is now so service oriented, and measures of capital in the service sector and measures of TFP are just harder to get right. So we thought at a first approximation, we'll just use labor productivity because at least we sort of know what we're getting, but it's a good point.
Do you have like data about income per industry, like the paid, like wage bill by industry kind of?
Yeah, we have wage bill by industry. We have GVA per worker by industry, by region. Yeah.
So maybe average wage instead of GVA per worker.
Why would that be a better measure?
Because like we generally attribute the labor share to the wages, and then like it will have like the productivity assigned to the labor. Honestly.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we'll have that with some of our wage premium stuff later, but we can definitely show this with that as well. Thank you. So what we're going to do here is we're going to try and infer the relative scarcity of different post-secondary skills in different regions by estimating the wage premium for those skills relative to someone with a secondary education, which in the UK is A levels. So we're going to estimate, for example, for a university wage premium, a region-specific university wage premium, which can be interpreted as the % higher pay received by a university graduate versus a non-university graduate of the same age and sex in the same region. So we'll run a log wage regression here, where what we're interested in is the coefficient on this interaction of whether or not someone is a university graduate and the region, with also region fixed effects, controls, dummies for age and sex. And the idea here is that the differences in the regional specific university wage premium, as well as changes over time, can help us infer the relative demand for university level skills. So let me just talk through a little bit more what assumptions we need to make for us to be able to say disentangle changes in the university wage premium by region over time into a demand and a supply component. The logic here is basically following the logic of Golden and Katz's race between education and technology work, where they infer changes in relative demand for university and non-university educated workers by making some assumptions about the production function, and then we know what the changes in relative supply are, and you can back out the changes in relative demand. So concretely, if you want to write it up in a model, you can write out output as a CS aggregate of university and non-university educated workers, and then assume that wages are equal to the marginal product of labor, perhaps with some markdown. Then you can just, by rearranging these expressions, write the log university wage premium as a function of these different terms. The log university wage premium is relative university educated versus non-university educated wage, which means you can then write the change in it as a function of these terms again, and I'll now go through what they are. So you can basically subset these different terms into 4 components. One is the change in relative demand for university and non-university educated workers. One is the change in the relative quality of university and non-university educated workers. It could be that part of the wage premium is reflecting nothing to do with the actual demand for the skills or for the people, but that the skills that people have has changed in relative term over time. One is the change in the relative supply of university and non-university educated workers. And then one would be a change in the relative markdown. So you could think about things that determine the markdown that might be differential collective bargaining across groups or differential degrees of monopsony power across groups. So what we're going to do, we're going to measure, yeah.
Do you have information about the place of birth?
No, unfortunately. So with this, we can only see where someone is right now. In a different piece of analysis, we have information about where someone went to university, to school, to secondary school, but we don't have place of birth. Yeah. What would you suggest we would do if we did? Because I don't know, if we can get it, then we should.
No, I mean, in one study we did on Mexico, we looked at people who live in who were born in Birmingham, lived in Birmingham, and so on, versus people who were born in Birmingham and live in London, right? Compared to people who were born in London, live in London, or people who were born in somewhere else in the southeast and live in London. So that you in some sense separate what might be the human, I mean, the region as a source of human capital versus the region as a demand for human capital.
Yeah, that would be great for us to be able to do. At the moment, we don't think we can get that in any individual level data that gives us an over time window. We might be able to get it in individual level data that is just for the last like 5 years, but that would still give us something cross-sectional. Yeah.
But it is very much a London story. We're now in a position where more than half of people who work in London weren't born in London. And that would not be the case across the other regions. So even though there's been a lot of migrant labour over 50 years, a lot of migrant labour would have been born in the UK, but not in London. So, you know, in a bit, we can ask, how does the arrival of graduate labour into London or labour into London affect the analysis? That is the
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Thanks, Ed. So then the key assumptions we want to make have here are we're going to compare university wage premia over time within regions and across regions. We can observe relative supply, right, of university graduates. We can just see that in the data. We can't observe the other three parts separately. So if we assume that the change in relative quality and the change in relative markdown are the same across regions, we can then use different regional patterns in this change to infer the change in the relative demand. And I'll show you that intuitively with the graphs in a second, but that's the kind of underlying logic of the assumptions. So what I'm showing you here now is those estimated university wage premia for each year from 1997 to 2019. And we're giving 5-year moving averages just to smooth the picture a little bit. That's plotted on the y-axis for each region. And then across the x-axis for each region is the share of university graduates among the private sector workforce, plotted again on a log scale. And so what you can see here, the big thing that jumps out is for most of the regions, you just see these downward sloping lines, which looks pretty much like a demand curve. As the share of and we're always moving from left to right because the UK saw a massive increase in university education during this period. So for each region, we're seeing as the share of university graduates increased in the private sector, the university wage premium relative to A-level graduates fell, as would happen if supply increases without a concomitant shift out in demand. You can see one region where this is very strikingly not the case, which is London on the top, where you're seeing a big increase in London in the graduate share, but you're seeing no change in the university wage premia. The other things to note from this graph are actually the levels. So in the 90s, the university wage premium was higher in every region outside of London than it was in London. Because of those patterns, where it's fallen substantially everywhere except London, you now see that the university wage premium is about 10% higher in London than it is outside of London. So interpreting this through the lens of the framework that I just talked about, what you can argue is that for most regions, we're seeing that the increase in relative supply of university graduates has in some sense alleviated some of the degree to which the scarcity of graduates was a binding constraint on regions' growth. Private sector firms were willing to pay a premium of 40 to 45% in the late 90s for a university graduate relative to an A-level graduate. By the late 2010s, they're willing to pay a premium of 25 to 30%. It's less relatively scarce compared to demand, except for in London, where demand seems to have shifted out as fast as supply. There is a question, though, as to whether this is true across different types of degree level skills. So now we do exactly the same thing, but we estimate this separately for STEM degrees, LFM degrees, we call them, so law, finance, and mathematics, and then other degrees. And we're estimating them all again relative to
mathematics with law and finance.
Management.
Oh, management, sorry. Management, good point. Misspoke. Math is in STEM, management is in law and finance. So the reason we pick law, finance, and management is because recent work from just the last few years by the IFS in the UK has found that law, economics, and management degrees are the degrees with some of the highest static returns in the UK. We don't have economics broken out separately, so we do finance. So what you see here is the same graphs again, with STEM in red, LFM, law, finance, management in green, and then other degrees in blue. And it's a little bit noisier. These are smaller categories. But what you see in general is that for most regions, for both the LFM degrees and the other degrees, you see the same downward sloping demand curve type pattern. The returns have fallen a lot for LFM degrees as the supply of them has risen. But for STEM, you see two things that are different. First, for every region at every level of relative supply, STEM is paid more, the return is higher. And also, as the STEM supply has risen, the lines have stayed kind of flat for most regions. The STEM wage premium actually hasn't fallen very much, and in some regions has risen. So again, if we interpret this through the lens of the framework that I just outlined, what we might conclude from this is that there is both higher relative demand from the private sector for STEM degrees, even compared to LFM degrees now at any level of supply, and there's been faster growth in that relative demand over time. One thing we can do to show that more concretely is estimate a regression of those wage premia on the changes in relative supply over time to back out that coefficient, the change in relative demand from that Katz-Golden equation I showed you. And I'm showing you that estimated coefficient here. So this is just taking those same assumptions, relative quality and relative markdown haven't changed across regions differentially over time. Then we can estimate the implicit annual demand growth by region for these different degrees. And what you can see here is that in every region, basically, the implicit annual demand growth for STEM is greater than for those other types of degrees. And that's just because, you know, exactly what you would infer from seeing downward sloping versus flat lines as supply increases. So this would suggest to us then that, yes?
Do you have any explanation for kind of the trajectory of Wales? It seems to stand out a little bit in comparison to the other regions.
No, it's a great point. This is something that we've been wondering about and need to think about more. We don't know, because you're right, Wales is the only region where the other non-STEM wage premium, actually, the demand seems to be growing over time and the wage premium didn't fall. Yeah, thank you. So what we would take from this set of analyses of graduate wage premia is that it looks like the mass expansion of higher education in the UK in the last 30 years was effective at alleviating some of the scarcity of university graduates in general as one of the binding constraints on growth in the non-London regions. But it seems that there is still, and perhaps a growing constraint in terms of STEM skills specifically. And given that STEM skills have historically been less highly remunerated than something like law, finance, or management, this is an important shift to focus on now where that seems to have flipped. The relative demand for STEM and something like law, finance, and management seems to have flipped not only outside of London, but also in London. The next thing we look at is the other set of post-secondary qualifications you can get in the UK, which are basically the non-university post-secondary qualifications, which we refer to here as advanced further education. These are not super common types of qualifications. So we're showing the same plot here, but the x-axis scale, which I think is probably too small for you to read, sorry, is really only going up to 10, 15% of the workforce. And the thing that we note here is basically in most regions, the share of people getting these qualifications has risen very little over time, but the wage premium has fallen pretty precipitously. So in most regions, the wage premium for one of these qualifications is only about 10% relative to having a high school age 18 education. So what that suggests to us is that, again, you know, thinking through the same framework, these advanced further education non-university qualifications are really not in much private sector demand relative to their supply. And that degree of demand, if anything, seems to have been falling quite a lot over time. That would suggest not necessarily that there is no set of vocational post-18 qualifications that are productive and valuable, but that on average, the set that we are offering and providing is not something that is in particularly high demand for the private sector.
Can I ask you, is this classification of STEM, LFM, and these ones, in the data, or do you aggregate them yourself? Is there more color in the data?
There's more color in the data. Would you suggest we break it down?
I don't know how big is the survey, no, but I'm thinking of the paper by Frank Nefke on co-worker complementarities, where he finds that you know, a lot of your return to your human capital is in how complementary is your human capital to the human capital of others in your establishment. He finds that larger firms can have more complementary labor forces because larger cities have more complementary labor forces, and in establishments where there's more complementarity. And so,
interesting.
So, for example, you know, if Our standard joke is that an anesthesiologist working on his own is not much better than a bad lecturer, putting you to sleep. But in the presence of a surgeon, it's a different story. So I'm wondering if this, if London simply allows for these complementarities to be better exploited, and so it's an agglomeration story. It may be happening within STEM or within some aggregation of these things. So
that's really interesting. We should definitely think about that because we have a quite granular codes for the degrees, particularly in the later years. So thinking about whether we can get some measure of diversity of degree types across regions or something, and use that to think about complementarity.
I mean, to do it a la the way Frank did it, you need the employer-employee match.
Yeah, we don't have that. No, so we couldn't do that, but we might be able to do something along those lines.
You might be able to take some complementarity measures from elsewhere and put it in.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
The other thing which is relevant here is that to the extent these non-university degrees were a signal, as university education expands, it may be that people are looking for the signal of having done this is not as good as a signal of going to university. And what we need to look at, we are going to get this data, is to look at STEM and law and other degrees in universities by university type. Because it might be that the more established Russell Group universities actually continue to have a good signal which delivers a wage premium, and the fall in the wage premium in the non-London regions might be happening in universities where the opposite of this, the signal becomes less effective. So actually people value that degree less than they used to because there's more of them and more of them from that university. And we're going to be able to get it by individual universities, which will mean we can look at top 5 universities, top 50 universities, and see whether the pattern persists.
Yeah, exactly.
Here, I wonder how much, because these other degrees have something to do with training and on-the-job training or some trainee flavor to them. And that has something to do with the difference between the skills you acquire while in school and the skills you acquire while at work. And I'm wondering if, you can only acquire experience in the industries that exist in your location. And industries might have very different like experience, wage curves. So that maybe, if you flip burgers, experience doesn't do much for you, but if you work at McKinsey, it does. And so there might be something in the slope of the experience wage curves where steeper professions are in London, say, and flatter professions are outside of London.
That's a really interesting point, and we should be able to look at that in this data and then compare it. And actually, you saying that makes me also think that another factor we should look at is how this changes within industry, because there was another big wave of deindustrialization in a lot of UK regions in the late 90s to mid 2000s, and it could be that these are really high return in manufacturing but not in services, and so you lose the high return opportunities over this period.
And there might be people who had very specific human capital associated with declining industries. And now, they have the same level of education, but they don't have the level of industry experience, or their industry experience is now less relevant or something.
That's a good point.
So that there's a loss of the human capital because of structural change or something.
That one we might be able to get at by breaking this out by age as well, right? Like if we look only at young people,
These are all private sector, aren't they?
These are just all private sector,
But
25
actually,
to 59,
There would be a lot of people now who would be doing level 3, level 4 in, for example, social care. To get onto management runs across the country, which would be in a private company. Where the wage of becoming more advanced in social care is really low.
That's a good point.
Compared to.
That's a very good point. Yeah, we should definitely do that.
So Frank, whom Ricardo was quoting, asked the
Oh, Frank is
question
here.
online.
Cool. Hi, Frank.
So he asked, is there a move towards longer degrees, masters, PhDs, etc., that could explain the patterns? My impression of the literature is that the premia have shifted to the extreme ends of education, also because the share of people with regular shorter college degrees has gone up.
Yeah, great question, and we should look at that as well. As a kind of broad characterization of the UK, the share with a master's or a PhD is much lower than in the US or in most continental European economies, but it still has risen a lot over time, and that's something that we should look at. Thanks, Frank. Another one? Yeah.
And these are from labor force surveys, right?
Yeah.
But can you follow an individual across surveys? Like, are there any overlapping?
There is kind of a 1-year overlap for a small subset of these individuals, but we've tried to estimate stuff and found it super noisy.
Okay, so you cannot have the London effect measured by the movers.
We tried, but it's really noisy. Yeah, sadly. Yeah.
Just not to apply last 3 years worldview to the past 20 years, but could it be also that STEM degree graduates are able to collaborate beyond their physical scope or more broadly? Meaning you could feasibly work with a London-based firm, or they're collaborating with firms that are not only kind of local firms. So maybe there is a play in which the STEM degree graduates are able to collaborate with more London firms or international firms, regardless of where they're located in a different region. And
That's interesting.
and have some productivity gains from that.
That's really interesting. My instinct would be that that would also apply to law, finance, and management, because there's like, especially in the UK, they're very internationally traded services, but we should see if we can actually measure that. That's a great
All
point.
this data is pre-pandemic, so any of those more recent things we don't see yet.
Yeah.
This is the one finding where the Treasury in the UK said last week it turns upside down. I think there was an assumption in government that there was still a binding graduate constraint. This is the first time anybody's shown that it looks like that's not the case.
Yeah.
So it's quite surprising.
Yeah, agree. The other thing that we do on education is, obviously, as we discussed already, this is a place where people can move. So the education patterns we see are an outcome of those differential returns. So one other thing to note is, if a region has few university graduates, is it because it produces few graduates, or is it because few graduates stay in the region? We can look at this with data only on England. This is to the point that Ricardo raised before, that we don't have that much data on where people are from, just where they are. But we have data on where people in England who got their degree in England did their age 16 schooling. And so what you see here, this is looking at the graduate share in each region relative to the English average. And the blue is the graduate share among 27-year-olds who are from the region, but not necessarily in it. And the red is the graduate share among 27-year-olds who are in the region. The big thing to take away here is that the pattern of graduate migration, as you can see, is very, very strongly towards London. London is a net gainer of migrants. And it is also true that the poorer regions are the ones that produce fewer graduates. That's the blue. But even for the regions that produce the fewest graduates, they still see net graduate outmigration to London. So in some sense, if you thought that the problem was one of supply and not demand, you would expect that the regions that produce few graduates the private sector would be trying really hard to keep them. But we don't see that. We actually see that even in the low graduate producing regions, people are still leaving on net to London, suggesting, again, kind of complementing that wage premium analysis to suggest that the issue is really one of a lack of private sector demand with high productivity, high paid jobs for graduates.
And if you hadn't had graduate migration in the last 50 years, those effects you assume would be even greater.
Great point, as in like immigration from other countries, because that's also disproportionately gone to London.
Very London South bias.
Super biased, yeah, exactly. And so you would still see these wage premium having diverged even more. So that's our basic argument on education. It looks like the average kind of constraint of graduate education as an issue has loosened over time, but there might be a specific issue in STEM. It doesn't look like these advanced further education qualifications are playing a role. So now we want to turn to the other segments of the question. The next one we're going to think about is infrastructure. Obviously, infrastructure matters to the extent that it enables regions to become larger agglomerations, to have a larger pool of complementary or skilled co-workers and co-workers, to have a larger pool of clients, to have a larger pool of suppliers. And it's worth noting, of course, that as we said at the beginning of the talk, one of the areas the UK seems to stand out is that its large cities seem to underperform relative to comparably sized cities in other countries. So what role is infrastructure playing in this? The first thing to note is that the UK spends relatively little on infrastructure compared to other similar countries. So this is spending as a share of GDP on road and rail infrastructure. The UK is in black. These are other OECD countries. You can see that in terms of rail, it was sort of in the middle of the pack, and it's very recently spending a lot on rail. These are projects that are very, very heavily skewed towards London and the like South to Midlands portion of the country. And in road, the UK is consistently one of the lowest spenders on infrastructure in the OECD. You can also see that of the spending that does happen in the UK, it goes very disproportionately to London and the Southeast. So this is spending capital and current spending on transport per capita in each region. And the green line at the top is London and the Southeast. So it's just far higher, the spending in London and the Southeast than elsewhere. And in terms of current spending, which is more just like, ongoing operation of transport systems, it's also higher in London and the Southeast than elsewhere. So sort of to a first approximation, you might think that the non-London regions are getting very, very low infrastructure spending compared to other countries. Again, the question is, do they?
Go back one second.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that the spread, the regional spread, they all like start around 100 on the graph on the right.
Yeah.
And then they spread out. So there's been a big increase in the inequality of spending between regions.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's something that we should dig into more. A lot of this is going to be explained by rail. So this blue line is going to be rail spending connecting West Midlands to London, this big high-speed rail project. But I'm not sure what explains some of the other ones. Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah.
How much of this means that they have less infrastructure outside London, and how much is just it's more expensive to build infrastructure in London?
That's got to be a part of it. It's absolutely right. So it's more expensive to build infrastructure in London, and particularly it's more expensive to build trains or rail, and a lot of the spending in London has been on rail. So part of this is that, but what we're actually going to show you now is trying to get at, okay, well, how much of this means, does this mean that the lack of the spending is a binding constraint or not? Part of it is going to be, is there actually less infrastructure? Part of it is going to be, is the infrastructure in high demand? So hopefully this is going to answer your question. So the first thing we want to do, and we're trying to again use this logic of to what extent is this factor of production in high demand by private sector actors relative to its supply. So we're going to argue that for roads, congestion is a good way to measure this, because congestion is the price, the amount of time people sit in traffic is the price that they're willing to pay at rush hour to reach their employer or to reach their client or whatever it is. So we measure the degree of road congestion across UK cities as compared to Western European and American cities. And we do this from 3 different data sets. And I'm just showing you the one from TomTom today, which is the GPS company, but it looks very similar across the data sets. So what this is showing here is across UK, US, and Western European cities, we're plotting their population on the x-axis, and we're plotting the degree of congestion at rush hour, basically on the y-axis. This is the percent slowdown of traffic caused by congestion relative to free flow at rush hour in 2019 to try and get rid of any kind of pandemic-induced different shutdowns. So the big thing to note from this graph is that UK cities look very much more congested than comparably sized US cities, which are in orange, and are also well above the average for comparably sized European cities in purple. It's also worth noting that the degree of congestion is very high in London, as you would expect, but it's actually almost as high in some of the other cities in the UK, like Manchester or Edinburgh. So what that would suggest to us is that not only within the UK, but also comparing UK cities to other cities in other countries, there is a great degree of demand for being able to get to work, basically, at peak time that is not being met efficiently by the existing road system. It's very congested. Road is the main way that people get to work in the UK outside of London. Most people drive, or some share of people get the bus. The share that gets train or rail transport to work in any city is always less than 15% outside of London, but trains still 15, yeah. So it's really not a common mode of transport outside London.
Within London, it would be over 70.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely over 50. It might be over 70. Yeah. So it's very different. So that, I mean, that's one illustration of the different availability of infrastructure, but we can still use rail data to kind of make the same inference question. So do we see that there is a high latent demand for rail travel in cities outside of London? Congestion is not exactly as good of a measure for rail as it is for road, because you're not paying an extra price in terms of time, but you are paying some extra cost in terms of comfort, and it does indicate some degree of latent demand for the ability to travel. But of course, other aspects of the rail network also impact whether or not there's latent demand. It could be, for example, that you would like to get the train to work, but the trains are so unreliable that you can't and you drive instead. So we're going to look both at congestion and at rail reliability. We don't have rail congestion measures across countries, so we just look across UK cities, and we take the first principal component of a number of different congestion measures of trains in the morning and evening rush hour, and then show that principal components standardized in the purple across cities. So one of the key things to take away here is that London is actually not as congested in terms of its rail as Birmingham. Birmingham is consistently more congested. And the number of other cities have similarly high peak congestion in rail. Manchester, Cardiff, Cambridge, Bristol, Nottingham, Leicester. So we're seeing a number of cities where there is, even though there's very little rail transport available for commuters, there's a lot of latent demand for it. The other thing to note here is, of course, as I mentioned, it could be that you don't get the trains to work because they're not reliable rather than because they're not there. Train reliability has become a big hot topic in the UK in recent years. We've got data here on punctuality of trains that arrive more than 3 minutes late and within 3 minutes, and trains that arrive within 15 minutes of their scheduled departure time. And then we've categorized the rail operators into those that primarily serve London and the south of England versus the rest. Purple is London and the south, red is the rest. So what you can see here is that particularly for the trains that are consistently very late, you see a very strong skew where the trains serving London are much more likely to be punctual than the trains not serving London. This in practice is exacerbated by the fact that there are more frequent trains for the services serving London than the other regions. So if your train is more than 15 minutes late or doesn't arrive at all and there's only trains every half hour, then that's a bigger knock-on impact on your commuting ability. The final point, of course, is that latent demand for transport is also affected by what the transport network looks like and where it reaches. So the next thing we can look at is using this new data from Komol, Eckert, and Mobarak, what is the area, the geographic area that people can reach from the city center by road or by public transport. And they use a cutoff of within 30 minutes on Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. as their kind of rush hour measure. So again, we can look at this for the UK, the US, and other Western European cities. The x-axis shows you the area accessible by public transport at rush hour. The y-axis shows you the area accessible by road at rush hour. So the big takeaway here is, as we would guess, European cities basically provide commuting through public transport. They have large areas that are accessible through public transport. American cities provide commuting through road. They have large areas that are accessible through road. UK cities seem bad at both. They don't do very well compared to other European cities in terms of an area accessible by transport. They don't do well in terms of American cities in terms of the area that's accessible by road. In fact, this comparison to European cities looks even worse than it would here, because European cities are also denser in terms of their housing. And so the area accessible by public transport also has fewer people in the UK for a given amount of area than the area accessible in European cities by public transport. So the UK is doing particularly poorly in international context at providing a dense road or public transport network to their residents. And we would argue that, therefore, all these indicators together suggest that it does seem to be the case that in a lot of large non-London cities, there is high latent demand to be able to get to the city centre more quickly at rush hour, to be able to work more effectively, and that this might go some way, although not all the way, to resolving this puzzle as to why these large UK cities aren't actually that productive, because they're not actually, in effect, that large. Only a much smaller share of the population can actually commute into the centre.
Is there any way for you to sort of estimate the number of jobs accessible within 30 minutes?
Now, that's a great question.
Because it might make your point. I mean, you're suggesting it, no?
Yeah, we're absolutely suggesting it, but if we can estimate that, that would be even better. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, because essentially what we're suggesting is that the limited scope of the transport networks means that these cities' agglomeration economies can't happen as effectively because they're smaller than they could be. The next indicator we want to look at is R&D, and this is one where it's particularly complicated to try and think about what indicators might be useful to indicate a lack of latent demand. So we'd love thoughts. Spatially, yeah. So the logic here is that we know that there's a national case for public investment in knowledge generating activities in R&D. We know that there are knowledge spillovers, but we also know that these happen spatially. So there's a lot of evidence of spatial spillovers within a very small concentrated space of R&D and knowledge generating activity. And there's also a lot of evidence of R&D and knowledge generating hubs like universities or big research hubs as focal points for the kinds of coordination externalities that can then generate new highly productive clusters. As you would expect, R&D expenditure is concentrated on the richer regions. So this is just R&D expenditure per capita and GVA per worker. But again, this might simply be a productive way to allocate the R&D spend because these are the regions with more scientists and these are the regions with more companies. So what question that we want to ask is what would be the absorptive capacity in non-London, the South regions for more public sector R&D activity that could then generate spillovers to the private sector and stimulate clusters of productive economic activity elsewhere?
What are the units of the y-axis?
Per capita.
What?
Oh, sorry, pounds per capita.
It looks remarkably small.
So the UK's R&D expenditure is like in total, yeah, this is total. The UK's R&D expenditure is quite low in international context in general. It's about 1.7% of GDP, and I think the OECD average is 2.2 or something like that. There's a little bit of a question about this because there's been a recent data revision that suggests it may not be low, but that's with the current data, that's probably why it looks quite low.
Yeah, but because these look like less than 0.1% of GDP.
Yeah, I think like if you multiply 0.0006 by 10 million, for instance, you will get like 6,000. So maybe it's in thousands of students or
yeah, maybe that's a good point that we may have the wrong axis labeling there in that case because yeah, it's like roughly 1.7% of GDP. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Then what we're trying to do to measure the absorptive capacity here, the question is, in what regions could you spend more on R&D as a public sector and generate productive economic activity from it? So we're going to say this is not measuring the bar, but this is measuring a bar that you should at least aim to meet, which is the distribution of private sector R&D spend, across regions, indicates regions that both have the capacity to conduct research and the capacity to absorb the activities of research, because the private sector is, choosing in some profit maximizing way where to do the research. So at the very least, the distribution of public sector R&D might be as equal as the distribution of private sector R&D. And what we find is that consistently, actually, public sector R&D is concentrated more on the rich regions than private sector R&D. So these maps show the share that each region accounts for of government R&D minus the share that it accounts for of business R&D. Or on the right, the share it accounts for of university, higher education R&D minus the share that it accounts for business R&D. So the way to interpret the colors are the purple regions are regions that get more as a larger share of government R&D than they do of business R&D and vice versa. So what this is telling us is that government R&D is very disproportionately skewed towards London and the South and Scotland, even relative to the skew that you see in the private sector. In the higher education, it's skewed towards basically London and Scotland relative towards the skew that you see in the private sector. So what this would suggest to us is that to a first approximation, there are a number of regions where the private sector has decided that there is absorptive capacity for R&D activity, and the public sector could therefore do more to direct more of its own research and development or additional research and development to those regions. And there are actually countries that do that. So this is showing that same pattern where we're saying the share of government R&D relative to business R&D just against the GDP per capita of each region. So it's showing that the skew in the UK is that richer regions are disproportionately invested in R&D terms by government. In Germany, the skew goes the opposite way. So rich regions still get more R&D, but government is doing relatively more than the private sector to skew their R&D to the poor regions. Sebastian.
Is that true even if you take into account differences in industry composition?
Is it true as in, is there a skew within industry across regions?
Yeah.
We haven't checked that. That's a good question. Would the logic be that maybe we can explain this because the R&D differences are just like German industry composition is different between East and West than like the UK?
Maybe in the previous slide, maybe, I don't know whether like in the South, you have industries related to defense or something like that,
that's
have
actually
like a higher intensity in R&D. I don't know much about the geography.
No, you're absolutely right. So the Southwest, this is a lot of the government R&D in the Southwest is a lot of defense R&D. And in Scotland, it would have been, I don't know if it's still defense too, and also possibly natural resource type R&D. So yeah, it's a good point.
Is there a way of estimating something like productivity of R&D?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to have, patents or quality weighted patents or something, because I can imagine, suppose that what you're observing is an optimum. Mm-hmm. You would allocate more resources where you expect to get more bang, right? But
But
Yeah,
even
you would want to know if the allocation is in line or against these measures of productivity.
The problem is that gets you into the point you made earlier about headquarters. Because where people apply for the patent isn't necessarily going to get money.
But even the patents, like for instance, defense industry wouldn't patent much. So there you will see some industry dependence on the patents.
But you can locate, you can use the location of the inventors.
Yes.
No?
So the patent data, you can go and identify the location of the inventor, so you can do the regions.
That correlates with where the patent applications from.
That's interesting. Yeah, we can try and do that. One thing we've tried to do is look at like measures of university excellence. And so this is the government spending is the direct government research, which is particularly things like defense. And then this one is higher education in the UK is mostly publicly funded. It's like 60-70% of all higher education R&D is funded by government. So we've looked at university research excellence across cities and tried to argue that you see sort of underfunding of these universities, but the patents.
Oxbridge doesn't.
Yeah, we ran into issues. We should probably dig it up again. Yeah.
Uxbridge doesn't show up on the right-hand side.
It's interesting, right? Yeah. So in fact, this red region is where Cambridge is in the east of England. And you're seeing it sort of systematically underfunded relative to the private sector in these graphs. It's partly because this was the period, we think, where the big private sector biotech and information sciences industry sprung up around Cambridge and maybe has sort of outweighed the government portion of that. Yeah. So the final thing that I want to talk about is access to finance. We've spent the most of the talk talking about reasons why it might be difficult for private sector economic actors to have productive economic activity in these non-London regions. But it might also just be the case that actually there are opportunities for productive economic activity. They're just difficult to finance. There's some problem with access to finance. This is a lot more nuanced to think through than if you're thinking about it across countries, because of course, this is a single country where in principle, there are no barriers to a London-based financial institution lending to or supplying equity capital to a firm based outside of London. But this is a live factor in the debate, and so we want to analyze it. The first thing is that it's worth noting that London-based small and medium-sized enterprises are much more likely to use external financing and receive more financing when they do use it, and most of the financial sector is based in London. So we see this massive skew of finance towards London, but of course that would be expected if London-based firms have a lot more productive economic activities and so are able to apply for and receive more financing. So what we would argue based on, again, the growth diagnostic logic is that if access to finance is more constrained outside of London, we might expect to see this showing up in some measure of prices or quantities. Higher interest rates, higher collateral requirements, higher rejection rates, higher appeals rates, lower default rates for the firms outside of London. If they're better firms are getting financed, more firms reporting feeling financially constrained. And just to sort of preview what I'm going to show you, we essentially find no evidence on any of these metrics that there's a difference in these things inside versus outside London. So for example, this is from a survey of small and medium-sized enterprises, asking them about various factors that correlate with their financing. So it's, do they think it's difficult to get external finance? Do they try and think about getting more? Do they need more? Is it an obstacle to access external finance? Is their cash flow an obstacle to doing business? Are they discouraged from seeking external finance because they don't think a bank will lend to them? Do they have confidence a bank will lend to them? And these are two different ways of expressing that. Did they inject funds into their own business because they had no other choice because they couldn't get any other financing? And we've ranked all of them so that the higher measure is indicating more financial constraints. And we've highlighted London in red. You can just see that essentially on all of these measures, London-based firms report feeling more constrained by a lack of access to finance than firms in other regions. We can then look at the appeals rate. So SMEs have a right to appeal to a national task force if they feel that they've been unfairly denied credit by a bank. So we can compare the region's share of those national appeals to the region's share of just general bank lending. If there was evidence that firms were disproportionately appealing in regions outside of London, we would see them in this top left portion of the graph. We don't. We essentially see the appeals share completely perfectly correlated across the non-London regions, really, with the lending share. And then we can aggregate evidence from a lot of different firm level studies on bank lending to ask whether we see different outcomes for these loan level variables. And essentially, again, once you control for firm differentials in industry and revenues and cash flow, you see no difference across regions in any of these outcomes. So again, suggesting that those banks are not behaving differently towards firms in London than outside of London, which is probably what you would have naively expected, but it's important to kind of confirm. But for a very small subset of SMEs, what is important is not bank lending, but equity financing. And this is particularly true for those with high growth potential that might end up being super productive. Only about 4% of SMEs ever apply for or intend to apply for equity financing. So it's only relevant for a small share, but it does matter. So what we do see here is that, again, using firm level data on equity investments for SMEs, we see that there's a big disparity in SME investment between firms in London and those outside of London that can only be partly explained by different firm level characteristics. So the way to interpret this graph is that the green shows you the likelihood of a firm receiving equity investment when they're in any region, conditional on this huge set of firm level controls, liabilities, revenues, industry, director level variables, etc. So you can see here is that the firms in the East Midlands, Yorkshire, and the West Midlands are only about half as likely to have received any equity investment as a comparable firm in London, which is the one line. Similarly, conditional on receiving that investment, firms in the Midlands and Yorkshire receive less equity investment than firms in London, even conditional on these firm level variables. Of course, again, this could reflect the fact that these firms have worse growth potential. So we can't rule that out, but we can at least say that there is an observably equivalent difference in equity financing for similar types of firms. Yeah. It's all firms. It's all firms. So obviously this second part is of firms that want it because it's only the firms that received it, but this one is all firms. Yeah. Yeah.
I know you've been talking about private investment, but I'm just curious because I know the UK had particular investment schemes for regional areas, if you guys have looked into their impact on I know that they've changed names multiple times depending on who was in the administration, but I know that particularly Northern Ireland and Scotland. So I was just curious if you guys have looked at it or are you just looking at private investment?
Yeah, good point. We haven't really looked at that. We've been looking at private investment to try and infer sort of what would be the market return. Yeah. But we should see, I mean, one interesting thing would be if you thought that equity financing was constrained for reasons that weren't low growth potential, you should see that there's a good return on these public investment schemes. So we should try and look at that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The final thing to note on this is that at this logic of sort of what would you expect to see, the camels and hippos type logic, what we might expect to see is that also if there's a problem in that London-based equity investors are not investing outside of London because they're myopic or it's too far to go or they don't have any networks there, so they don't really know who are the good prospects, you would expect investors based in these other regions to invest a lot in their regions because the London-based investors are leaving money on the table because they're not going to Birmingham and they don't know anything about the firms based in Birmingham. So what we try and do here is we look at the private sector equity investors that are based in each region, and we ask what share of their equity investments went to London and the Southeast based firms in their home region or firms in the rest of the UK. And what you see is that mostly, even in the financially constrained regions, we're seeing very little investment in their own region and actually quite a lot of investment in London. So the West Midlands is where Birmingham is. That was one of the most constrained regions on the previous graph. But investors based in the West Midlands are actually putting about a third of all their investments in London and the Southeast based firms and very little in the West Midlands, which is not really that consistent with what you would expect if there was a lot of money on the table in the West Midlands that London based investors were ignoring. The one that stands out here is the Northwest, which is where Manchester is, where you actually do see that there's a very, very large share of local investment that goes locally, maybe suggestive of those investments being ignored elsewhere. And the final thing we look at on this is that if you thought that non-London-based investment opportunities were being ignored, you might expect that once they have been found, they will be invested in at the same rate. They have good growth potential. On the other hand, if you think that the problem is that non-London-based equity investment opportunities have worse growth potential, then you might end up seeing this in equity funding trajectories. So what this shows you is that for those investors, those SMEs who actually receive any equity investment, how many funding deals have they had by year 7? It turns out that in London and non-London, on average, the average SME that got any equity investment, 7 years after their first one, got one more round. So there's like 2 rounds total. But then if you look at the amount of investment, these firms got similar amounts on average in their first funding round. In fact, the non-London firms got a bit more. But when you look at the total cumulative funding they got by year 7, the London-based firms are getting a lot more. So that's sort of indicative of the London firms having better growth potential. So even once you've identified a given firm as an equity investor, you're ending up putting more rounds into the London-based firm, putting more money into the rounds of the London-based firms than the other ones. So we argue that there's no evidence of constraints on bank lending. There's maybe some evidence of constraints on equity financing, but it's quite unclear whether this just reflects differential growth prospects. On average, it doesn't feel like lack of finance is a particularly binding constraint for growth in the non-London regions. And I'm going to flash this up very briefly in the interest of time, but I know we alluded to it earlier. Migration doesn't equalize returns across place, probably because we're in some kind of spatial equilibrium. It doesn't seem like London is the UK is a low mobility country. People move quite a lot across regions. But the big thing that stands out in the UK is people leave the high productivity region, which is London, and move out of it to the low productivity regions, which is the wrong direction if you think migration should be generating regional convergence. And the reason for that is that when you look at wage premium for renters, the wage premium for renters in terms of nominal incomes is highest in London across any part of the income distribution. But when you take out housing costs, London is actually a very bad deal. If you're low income, it's okay if you're medium income, and it's only really worth moving there if you're high income. Yeah, Mohammed.
And if you, do you have data after COVID? Like, was this accelerated after?
Yeah, we should look at that. We don't. The London housing market has continued to be crazy, but we should have a look at that. Thank you. So I just want to sort of wrap up now, as I'm conscious that we're coming up to 11:30. We basically take away from this collage of evidence across these different factors that there's actually relatively little support for three very prominent views in the UK debate. One, that the low graduate share in general is a primary binding constraint on regions' growth, that the unequal access to finance outside of London is a widespread constraint on growth, or that a low propensity to move for non-cost of living reasons is responsible for the lack of convergence. Instead, we argue that specific constraints on STEM degrees seem important. There is a lot of evidence that certain cities have insufficient transport infrastructure, and this is limiting the effective size of their agglomerations. Skewed public R&D spend, subject to the concerns we raised about sort of incremental returns, may be limiting innovation in the places that actually have absorptive capacity to do it. And then it may be the case that a lack of equity finance is an issue in certain regions. And of course, finally, that limited housing availability in London, regardless of what it's going to do to productivity in other regions, reduces the ability of migration to act as a convergence mechanism. So that's what we have for you today, and any more comments and feedback are hugely appreciated.
This is spectacular work and super interesting use of data to elucidate issues. I thought my reading of the STEM results was the opposite. That what you find is that there's a lot of demand for STEM in London and not so much in other places. So controlling for supply, there's declining returns elsewhere, but not in London. So I would say it's still sort of like a place-based puzzle, and it's not a supply side story from what I interpreted you saying, you know. It would appear that the puzzle is, why is it that you can generate high returns to agglomeration in London and not elsewhere? Mm-hmm. Right? That's the puzzle, because obviously if you solve the housing problem in London, what that will do is increase the population of London. It doesn't fix the problem you want to address.
No, yeah.
So from that point of view, it would appear that we're exploring that in other countries that housing and transport, the joint of that, how far people live from the places of work and how costly it is to move from A to B, might be a major friction in the labor market that might limit the size of the labor force you would have access to in places that to begin with are smaller already. Mm-hmm. So that transport infrastructure, caught my attention as something interesting.
Oh, that's interesting to hear.
We're trying to study why you got these huge metropolises coming out of nowhere in the American West, cities like Denver or Phoenix or Albuquerque and so on, that are 2 million plus, and nobody lived there, yesterday. So, and I do think that there's a role for government spending in creating the agglomerations in those places. There was also
spending been roads, a lot of road spending.
I think it's more defense, procurement, things where you install a capacity there. Part of them were also, mining plus, so mining generating mining in places that had good agriculture. So it got, maybe this is in Britain's past, that you had the coal and the iron ore in places close. So that got industrialization going. That generated the agglomeration. There was an agricultural periphery that also was involved in the story. So I don't know what happens when those engines of agglomeration disappear.
Yes.
And you want more human-based engines of agglomeration. That there might be this extreme. We say if you can put some things everywhere or all things somewhere, convexity means that it's better off to put everything somewhere than putting some things everywhere. And that, it's not a solution, but it will be an explanation for the puzzle. But then again, it would be interesting. Is this true also of Paris?
Yes. So there was a question online asking the same thing.
I need to run. Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone.
Like, have you explored the role of international migrants, for instance? Maybe like there are these high-skilled international migrants attracted to London, but other places of England. Or,
So we've done like all our returns analysis with and without people that were born in the UK as a rough proxy. We can't tell when they came. And you see the same patterns. One thing that's worth noting about the international migrants, as you say, is that they, as I said earlier, they move very, very disproportionately to London when they're university educated. So in some sense, given that London was like hoovering up all these international graduates as well as domestic graduates over this period, it suggests that if we'd had less international migration, we would have seen the path of university wage premium diverging even more. Because in London, you wouldn't have had this inflow of international migrants to increase supply. So you would have seen the premium go up more. So that's the way we've been thinking about it now. But are there other aspects we should be considering?
Maybe like they are the drivers, like they start firms, they are the superstar effect.
That's true. Yeah, because there's a lot of evidence that immigrants are disproportionately like to be entrepreneurs. So that's something we should. I mean, there's also a question we really haven't dug into. As with the US, the UK, I mean, it's actually probably a little worse, has not a great visa system for keeping all the many good people that come to our universities from overseas, who could be local drivers of growth to the extent that they would then start businesses and join research institutes. So that's something we should look at as well. Yeah.
Thanks again for the great presentation. It's possible two questions. The first one is around maybe the political or administrative reasons why some of these constraints have been so difficult to fix. So and specifically in the point number 2, in the transport infrastructure of non-London cities, you say that have very high congestions. I would imagine there's a lot more political demand for those to be fixed. And it seems like other cities in Europe do have a lot better capacity to expand that. So I'm curious maybe why in the UK does that story persist? And I don't know if there's a political or administrative reason why that's so.
Do you want to speak to that, Ed, first?
I think
that's a good question.
The reality is that because of the kind of geography and the density, it's actually very difficult and expensive to put this infrastructure in. And the one place where the Treasury has tended to conclude the returns really justify the expenditure were in London. So actually, there's just like a big London skew. The big transport projects have been London focused in terms of expenditure. And that the Treasury would say that's what the rate of return analysis justifies. And to the extent that there's been spending outside London and South East transport, it's tended to be small scale, dealing with particular road section, a particular node, rather than big projects. And then to the extent there's been large projects in more recent years, they tended to be connecting to London rather than across London. So the whole big debate has been about whether we ought to be connecting the northern cities. De facto, that hasn't happened yet.
And one of the big questions that we're actually tackling in a companion paper that I forgot to mention that Ed is doing with Dan and two other authors is interviewing regional and national policymakers that have been instrumental in this policy since 1979, including all the chancellors and the regional and development authority heads and things, to try and get at the question of governance and politics. And particularly, the UK has a super centralized system of allocation of spending and decision making, very, very little devolution of powers, and whether that might be a factor as well. Kishan, from on high.
Hi, thanks so much. This is was such a amazing presentation. My question was, so you'd mentioned in the beginning of the presentation that agglomeration doesn't seem to explain the difference, and I was wondering if you guys had looked into how much does agglomeration explain versus not explain. As Ricardo mentioned, we're doing some work. We'll call it remoteness of, how much of a place's complexity or a place's income is determined by just agglomeration and market potential. And it'd be interesting to know whether the story could be something like, okay, so market potential is not as strongly correlated with productivity in the UK as other places. There are these places that have seemingly high market potential and agglomeration, but are very low productivity. And then a second level to say, actually, when you look at, number two, they're not actually have as much market potential and agglomeration as you would expect, or that some other thing prevents them from capitalizing on their agglomeration. So I just wonder how much of the story is explained by agglomeration to motivate why they need to look for another explanation.
That's really interesting. I would love to connect after the talk on what the work you're doing on market potential to see what we can apply here. In terms of how much is explained, it's kind of a tricky question to answer in the UK, because if you estimate, if you just run a regression of like the size of the productivity of a place on its size and control for educational composition, which is a very basic way to get an agglomeration, you get a coefficient of 0 if you exclude London. So in some sense, nothing is explained by agglomeration because our cities aren't more productive than our towns. But if you were to apply an agglomeration factor from elsewhere, then we could try and get somewhere like that. But I think what we need to do is get this market potential measure as well. So I'll connect with you on that.
So instead of doing something really complicated, just a very crude measure of sort of the distance weighted population or economic activity or GDP around you, so that it's not just including your own size, but your distance to other places.
Oh, that's a great point. That's very interesting.
One of the questions the policymakers put to us in using this binding constraints framework is how you should think about measuring relative binding. Of these different factors, how do we decide which is more important? We can sort of show that we think that list of 5 is important, but trying to work out the relative priority or how much they collectively can explain the whole, something which I don't think we've kind of got our heads around yet.
Yeah.
There's a kind of second thing, which is also in the UK debate, it's all now about it's importantly about, not all about, the level at which decisions are made and how much should we be devolving from centralized decision making in London to giving actors flexibility over the way in which they make decisions and being accountable for them. Again, that is something which so far we haven't found a way to see in data to measure. And so, our paper at the moment on this paper can't talk about the one thing which is actually everybody wants to talk about, which is all based upon what people kind of believe rather than what they can demonstrate. And part of, as Anna said, we've done these 85 hour-long interviews with all the former prime ministers and chancellors, but also business, academics, local government leaders, and they all believe it. But none of them quite know why they believe it, but they all do believe that devolving is important and that they've all failed and there's been too much instability. And so again, if any of you know or seen things we've missed in terms of the relationship of governance and level of decision making. And the other thing I'm just going to say, because I know we're almost at the end, I was here 88 to 90, did a paper with Larry Summers and Larry Katz on regional unemployment differentials, the north-south divide in the UK, and at the time, same results on migration, but it was all about employment. And it's so interesting to see how much this has changed from being really a story about quantities to a story about prices and demand.
Yeah.
Douglas, do you want to ask her afterwards?
No. I mean, I just had a comment on exploring perhaps similar to the R&D mechanism and FDI mechanism, foreign direct investment, as an alternative way to explain kind of latent potential of activities. The other question I had on or comment to explore on differences in productivity. I know you said, look, what happens if we apply the productivity of London to different sectors only in tradables? And I was wondering how you manage some services there, because some services are tradable, non-tradable, and it's difficult. And in that light, I was just wondering, again, if we're talking about the same activity, if we could use occupational vectors to try to explore this idea of kind of the wealth of complementarities that exist in regions versus in London. Because we might be talking, so experience in Mexico, we might be talking about car manufacturing, but in reality, in parts of London, we're talking about assembly, and in other parts, we're actually talking about design and development, and we call both of those things car manufacturing, but in reality, the activity involved is radically different.
And our problem is, I think that is in the UK, less true in manufacturing, much more so in business services, because the truth is that the kind of business services that should be done in London and the South East are substantially internationally tradable. And the kind of services being done in London and in Manchester will be important, but much less tradable. But actually, the classification would probably allocate them to the same firm, the same classification and the same occupation. But actually, the value added of the role and the kind of is quite different. So at the moment, that's not captured.
The way we try to solve that in the past somewhat can be with FDI measures, to try to figure out if the FDI is attempting to serve a local market or to serve a global market. Sometimes you can register that. Or sometimes depending on the effective number of occupations that are involved, because depending on the wealth of it, you can figure out a more sophisticated operation probably needs a wider range of occupations to perform quote unquote the same duty. So depends on the clarity of the data.
Have you ever managed to do that with either law or finance?
I think Sebastian has tried to do it with government, but I don't know if it's thanks to law and finance. But yeah, I can imagine the difficulty, because we'd say a lawyer is a lawyer. I don't know how they differentiate the data.
There's a bunch of people in London and a bunch of people in Manchester. People in Manchester are doing a very different job.
But I don't know.
I think that this is also related to the comment made earlier by Ricardo on this thing of multi-establishment firms, and like maybe part of like the revenue of the whole group being accounted mostly in London, because it's where you're like getting everything together. And maybe that's biasing a little bit of a view that we're getting from the who's accounting for the gross value added.
So maybe wage bill. Okay, let's thank Anna and Ed again, and let's finish. And we had like more than 30 online participants.
Oh, wow.
So
Thank you all.
like it was a very well attended. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.